Every single Dead by Daylight killer ranked from worst to best based on strength. The worst killer in my opinion is going to the Trapper. This is basically a killer without a power the entire game. You have to start the match going around the map to even get your power to begin with. Plus your power is essentially useless once you have it because a survivor can just follow you the entire game disarming your traps. The only time the Trapper is good is if you hook a survivor in the basement and you camp, and that's just really boring. Yes, it's really satisfying to get trap kills, but with the amount of indoor maps nowadays and how much less foliage there is on every map, this killer is just gone awful. The next spot is going to Freddy. Freddy went from riches to rags. He went straight down to the bottom. He is so garbage right now, but honestly, I don't really mind. The best part of his kit is definitely being able to teleport because you can get around the map pretty quickly. Snares and pallets are just like kind of bad. Snares are way better than pallets, but there's almost no point in using Freddy when you could just use Clown and get the same effect. The next spot is going to Myers. I don't like putting Myers this low because his add-ons can completely make him busted, but I think besides those add-ons, because those are inevitably going to get nerfed, I think Myers is in a pretty rough spot. It's not that he's a bad killer. He's just extremely outdated. I just think he needs to be updated because right now, besides the add-ons, he's just a killer with a smaller tear radius and then every once in a while has a limited time ability. But this ability isn't even that strong if you're against a good team because they'll just either hide for the entire duration or they'll have the injured survivors focus on chase. So he basically gets no value out of it except for the increased lunge. I will say the window vault speed paired with bamboozle and superior anatomy makes him a pretty solid chase killer, but regardless, I still think he needs some buffs. The next spot is going to Clown. A lot of people think that Clown is the worst killer in the game, and I've never really understood it. I do think he's bad, don't get me wrong, but I feel like he's a lot more powerful than people think. I feel like if you're good at Survivor, you can absolutely obliterate people when you're playing Clown because you know exactly what they're going to do and you know exactly where to put your gas. But of course, if you're against a good team, they're going to destroy you and just pre-drop everything and you're not going to get any pressure the entire game. Underrated killer, but still F tier. The next spot is going to Legion. You know, Legion's rework made them definitely stronger and more fun to play as, but when it comes down to it, it's still kind of the same killer that it's always been. If survivors just don't group up, you basically have no power except for the power to injure somebody. And then to down them, you have to chase them regularly. So I wouldn't say they're very good. It's unfortunate that all of the M1 killers are this low in the list, but that's modern DBD for you. The next spot is going to the Pig. Honestly, the Pig is really hit or miss. She can be much higher on this list, but she can also be much lower on this list. Her dash attack is pretty bad. It's one of the worst dashes in the game, but it was very useful when you paired it with Save the Best for Last because you could damage your obsession without losing stacks. But now the Stabiffel's getting nerfed where you lose stacks regardless of how the obsession takes damage. It kind of makes her worse. Plus the dash just takes so long to like wind up and charge, and it's just really easy to counter. But the reason she's kind of higher on this list is because of her head traps. Obviously her head traps can be quite a nuisance, and you could pair Pig with like Pentimento Plaything to make her head traps actually kind of viable. So she has some decent slowdown throughout the game, but she does have to chase survivors regularly to down them, which makes her harder to use. The next spot is going to Dredge. I have a feeling a lot of people would disagree with me, but I think Dredge is so bad. Like his teleporting is nice because you have mobility and map pressure, but you'll make this really cool play where you teleport right to a locker right where the survivor's going, and then it's just locked and you lost all this distance to the survivor. In my opinion, he's one of the most frustrating killers to play as because you'll make this cool play, but then you get punished for no reason because the survivor just decided to click one button earlier in the match. And his anti-loop isn't even that good either. It's kind of just a 50-50 or the survivor will just W key to a different loop. The next spot is going to Trickster. I don't really know how I feel about this placement because I haven't played him since the new update, but I just don't see a reason to ever use this killer over the other two range killers. Like he's just a significantly worse Huntress. The only reason he's good is because he can face camp much easier with his main event, but for people who don't like to face camp, he's kind of just not great. Like yeah, you're kind of guaranteed to injure or down survivors in chase. It just takes a long time to do it, and he's really bad outside of chase. So he's just slowly but super oppressive in one area and terrible in every other area. I just think he's one of the worst design killers in this game, and honestly they should just rework him entirely. The next spot is going to, I'm sad to say, Ghostface. I used to love playing Ghostface. I think he's super fun, but nowadays with all these like optimal survivors, it is so hard to get use out of his ability. He's extremely map dependent because if you're on something like Haddonfield or Ormond or something, it's going to be pretty hard to stay in your power. Plus, there's not really any point in using your power in chase because it's really easy to just do moonwalk mind games. I will say that the buff that he got where the survivors that you stalked cannot kick you out of your ability is a nice change and definitely brings him up higher, but in the end, he's still an M1 killer with essentially no ability if the survivors are good. However, the reason he's high up on the list is because if you do get a map that's good for him, he can be very strong. Maps that have a lot of gens indoors and unsafe areas can essentially give him a ton of free hits throughout the game. The next spot is going to Nemesis. His entire ability is essentially RNG depending on what the zombies do. Like sure, he has this tentacle, which is good in chase, but he's kind of like Trickster where he's extremely oppressive in chase, but it just takes a long time to down people because you have to hit them 3 times. I would say the best part of his ability is he can just shred through pallets, but it takes a while to get to tier 2, so by the time you can can even use this ability, there might be like 1 or 2 gens done. Plus your zombies are completely RNG dependent, so that just kind of makes him a less skillful and less reliable killer. Plus it's kind of hard to do mind games in loops because his feet are so damn loud. The next spot is going to the Doctor. The Doctor used to be a pretty solid killer, but has just been going down. He's not that bad though. He has a decent mix of slowdown and anti-loop, but it just takes way too long to actually catch up to a survivor when you're using your anti-loop. So yes, his anti-loop can be good and can be strong if you're able to time it properly, but with ping and latency issues, sometimes it won't even work properly, and usually survivors will just be able to make it to a different loop anyway when you're charging your shock. Plus, when you become good at killer, you don't really need his static blast for information because usually you know where everybody is, so that part of his power is sometimes useless. Moving on to the next killer, it is going to Wraith. I also think Wraith is a pretty hit or miss killer. He can either obliterate teams from the speed boost from his uncloak, or the survivors will just pre-drop pallets the entire game, and there's kind of nothing he can do. I do definitely think that he's one of the better M1 killers in the game though, just because there's so much that you can do with him. Like you can play stealthily, you can play aggressive and chase, you can play hit and run, you can do all sorts of playstyles with him, which makes it more difficult for the survivors to counter because they have to understand how to counter every playstyle. But in the end, he's still an M1 killer that has to chase survivors, which can be pretty tough against a 3 or 4 man. Moving on to Skull Merchant. I honestly don't know how I feel about this placement. I never play her because she's extremely boring, and I never play against her because nobody ever plays her because she's extremely boring. So she's either really good or really bad, but I definitely think she's worse than she used to be. And now she's kind of like Nemesis and Trickster again, where she can easily injure survivors. It just takes so long to do it. The survivors have to be scanned by her drones 3 times to become injured, but it is a pretty solid way of injuring survivors. She's just so poorly designed that nobody cares to play her, so it's hard to rank her. And then we have the Knight, 2 of the most boring killers put right next to each other. The Knight's the same thing where he's extremely impressive in chase, but really bad outside of chase. Like he has no mobility, no map control. The only thing he has is the ability to absolutely destroy survivors in chase if they don't hold W. But pretty much every survivor holds W nowadays, so it's kind of hard to catch up to them. But if you're good at zoning and you really understand how the loops work to force the survivors in a certain direction, then he can be pretty decent because you can get essentially insta downs. Next, I'm gonna give it to the Onryo. This is a hard thing to rank because they just announced a rework to her to make her less about the condemned playstyle and more about like actually getting rewarded for hooking survivors. So I think this rework definitely makes her worse because she used to be able to almost get a guaranteed insta kill if you just teleported constantly while using her ability, but now it's kind of hard to tell. So I'm just gonna leave her here for now. The next spot is going to Billy, who's in a very similar boat to Sadako. They just announced a rework for him as well, where your overheat mechanic is now an overdrive mechanic where you're actually buffed when you're in this mode. Plus it's much easier to get into overdrive than it was to get into overheat. And they buffed almost everything in his base kit with his speed and his collision detection and all of that stuff, which makes him feel much better to play as. But I still don't think he's that great. Like I think he can be good in specific situations, but the reason he's so bad isn't necessarily because of his power. It's more because of all the maps nowadays. All of the OG maps that he used to be really good on have been reworked to have better graphics, but this also meant that they added a ton of random debris everywhere, which totally blocks him from using his chainsaw for mobility, which is what differentiates him from Bubba. Plus there's so many indoor maps now that can make his power completely useless, so it's just kind of luck whether or not you'll be able to use this killer well. The buffs are an extremely welcome change though, so I'm very glad that they did that. The next killer is going to the Singularity. The Singularity is good, but his skill cap is way too high for the power that you can get out of him. Like I do think that he can be very oppressive, it's just really hard to do so. I do like the concept of this killer where he kind of starts as like a trap information based killer, and then he turns into this like beast of a chase killer when you infect survivors, but it's just like a lot of effort for not that much power out of him. I do think he's strong because he has a lot of map pressure and a lot of map mobility, which are 2 of the most important things in my opinion for a killer, but it's just too hard to get good value out of him. The next spot is going to Hag. Hag used to be much higher on this list, but ever since they made it so that survivors can wipe away traps, she is just significantly worse. Traps used to be this thing that survivors had to purposely avoid, which gave her a ton of really solid map pressure, which is the only thing that she has going for her. But now that any survivor can wipe away traps, it makes her so much worse. Just like Trapper, she can have a survivor following her around the entire time and wiping away her traps, rendering her almost completely useless. Hag already has a low player count, and I think this is just going to drop her even further. The next spot is going to Bubba. Underrated killer in my opinion. I think he's honestly way stronger than people give him credit for. Sure, there are certain maps where he's just undeniably awful, like Gideon Meat Plant, but if you use him properly and you know how to moonwalk with his power and stuff, you can absolutely destroy survivors. You're able to save so much time on chases just by insta-downing them, and you can create a ton of dead zones, which allows you to snowball later in the match. The only problem with Bubba is that windows are so strong on him, so if you get a map with a lot of really good windows, you're going to struggle quite a bit. So you're kind of forced to bring Bamboozle, which I don't really like, but it is what it is. Also, most of his add-ons are completely awful. Then we have the Deathslinger. I think Deathslinger's power totally depends on the user and how skilled they are in first-person shooters. Like if you grew up on first-person shooters and like quickscoping and all that stuff, I think this killer can be very very strong because you're going to hit your shots constantly. But if you don't really have an FPS background, I feel like it makes it much harder to hit those crazy shots. So you kind of just have to use your ability much less and chase survivors normally, which is much more detrimental since he's a slower killer. I think he's another very underrated killer that can completely destroy survivors in loops, even in ones that you wouldn't expect because of all the holes that you could shoot through. The next spot is going to the twins. The twins are another very poorly designed killer where they have an extremely strong power and chase that's essentially uncounterable for the survivors, but then it takes you a really long time to actually go and pick up the survivor and hook them and all that. So you lose a lot of precious time. So yeah, you can down people and injure people very quickly, but all that time saved gets mitigated by the time it takes for you to go and pick up that survivor. But the reason she's so good, however, is because she's very, very good at slugging and camping. Since it doesn't kick you out of victor when you down a survivor, this means that you can down multiple survivors in succession with your oppressive ability. So it's really easy to snowball if survivors aren't healing and staying on top of things. The next spot is going to Pyramid Head, which is in a very similar boat to Deathslinger. Like, he's very hard to use, but he can be really oppressive if you know what you're doing. Like, he has a pretty solid anti-loop ability, but the ability to save time by caging survivors or mooring them gives him a lot more strength because he has a ton of map pressure. Plus, there's a lot of situations where you're able to get double hits on survivors that are unhooking or survivors that are rescuing from a cage. The next spot is going to Pinhead. I think Pinhead has a really good balance of mobility, map pressure, and anti-loop all combined into one. His anti-loop, although not great compared to other killers like Clown, is still pretty useful and can interrupt actions, but his map pressure is where he really shines. He can just obliterate solo queue teams because of his box, since they'll either have multiple survivors going towards the box to prevent the chain hunt, or nobody will go for the box because they think somebody else will do it, so they're just stuck in chain hunt for a while. And chain hunt is something you really have to deal with, because if you don't deal with it, you can't work on generators, you can't progress on pretty much anything, and if you're in chase and you get hit by these things, it's going to be pretty detrimental for you. Plus, once you get really good at Pinhead, you can kind of figure out where the box will spawn, which can help you get so much information and map pressure. The next spot is going to the Artist. Artist is just a really solid killer. She's good in chase. She pairs really well with Dead Man Switch, which not a lot of killers do, which is a great way to get slowed down on her. And it's really easy to figure out which generators you need to pressure because of her crows. If you're just shotgunning the entire game, she's not going to be that good, but if you're able to use 1 or 2 crows to hit a survivor and then shotgun them, she can be a very, very strong killer. The next spot is going to the Demogorgon. I have a feeling that a lot of people are going to disagree with me on this one and think he's much lower on the list, but I definitely think he's one of the better killers in the game. I kind of think that you just have to have a very fast-paced mind to do well with this killer, especially against good teams. Because to use him at his maximum potential, you have to do these crazy moonwalk mind games while also timing your shred perfectly to make it hard for the survivors to loop you. Plus, he has a somewhat decent teleport ability, but really his shred attack is why he's so good. He can zone survivors easily. Some of the strongest loops in the game, like Shack or Long Walls, are completely destroyed by him, and you can shred through pallets, no pun intended. The next spot is going to the Xenomorph, which is very similar to Demogorgon, so she's kind of like a stronger version of Demogorgon, but with a couple more downsides. For one, your tail attack doesn't go as far, but you have the upside of it being essentially uncounterable for the survivors, so you can down survivors and injure them extremely easily, even over loops, which Demogorgon can't do. You can teleport around the map almost whenever you want, which is really useful, but she has the downside of not being able to manually place your portals, which doesn't really matter too much in the grand scheme of things because the tunnels are usually near important objectives. But then there's the downside of flame turrets, which can completely kick you out of your power, which also doesn't really matter too much because you just get in your tunnel and then you immediately have your power back again. So a much more oppressive anti-loop ability, but has a lot more downsides. The next spot is going to Wesker, a very, very solid and very fun killer. I'm pretty sure in the most recent patch notes, they're removing one of the moon dash or some sort of tech on Wesker, which definitely makes him worse, but I still think is a very strong killer. He has a lot of mobility, he has some map pressure with his infection, including the unfortunate ability to easily tunnel somebody, and his power is surprisingly good in chase. The next spot is going to the Huntress. I unironically think that Huntress has one of the highest skill ceilings in the entire game. The cross maps that you can do are absolutely insane and can really help differentiate a good Huntress from a bad Huntress. If you're not going for cross maps, she's still a very solid killer. She's great at close range pressure and loops and if they're unhooking and whatnot, but she really shines when you're able to go for those cross maps. They don't have to be completely random shots across the map because obviously people just do that for fun. But if you're going for long shots, so to speak, you can deal so many health states so consistently and so quickly that it just makes her a very strong killer. The only downside to this killer is that she has very, very bad mobility. So if survivors split up really well against her, it's going to be hard to keep up. The next spot is going to the Plague. The reason the Plague is strong is because she puts survivors into a very difficult lose-lose situation. You're either completely injured the entire game, which is obviously bad because then it's kind of like the killer has unlimited exposed, so it'll be hard to get unhooked and it'll be really easy to snowball pressure. But if the survivors do decide to cleanse to heal themselves, she gets one of the strongest abilities in the game with her Corrupt Purge. Corrupt Purge can absolutely obliterate survivors, but it is kind of map dependent, I'm not gonna lie. If you're on Larry's or something, it's gonna be a lot harder to use your Corrupt Purge. The reason she's not overpowered though is because she still has to chase survivors if they choose not to cleanse, and she has absolutely no ability if they decide to just stay injured the whole game. Plus, some really good survivors will only have certain survivors cleanse in very specific areas of the map that makes it unreasonable and detrimental for the plague to go out of their way to go pick up that corrupt purge. So there are a pretty decent number of ways to counter her, but I still think her ability to just have everybody injured all match is very strong. The next spot is going to one of my favorite killers in the game, and that is the Oni. Oni is so good. He's essentially a better version of Myers. You have to chase survivors normally to even get in your power, but once you get your power for the first time, it's so much easier to just snowball pressure throughout the entire match. His demon dash is so good and so fun to use, and it's really easy to just keep survivors injured the entire game. The reason he's not higher though is because survivors that hold you from getting your power early in the match and just pre-drop pallets and make sure you don't get that first injure can make you much weaker because you're not able to start that snowballing process early enough in the match. And finally, for the top 4 strongest killers in the game, if you made it this far, go like the video and drop a banana emoji in the comments below. I'll try to heart every single one of them. The 4th best killer in DBD is going to Chucky. Chucky is so fun, but he is kind of uncounterable with the scamper. His dash is one of the strongest abilities in the game because you can just destroy survivors in loops, and you have it very often. Plus, his ability to scamper over windows and under pallets makes it pretty difficult to counter him. So yes, there's some counterplay if you're able to use corners and you're able to use walls, but on a lot of the areas on the maps that are usually very strong for survivors like god pallets, there's almost nothing you can do to counter Chucky. Plus, it's hard to keep track of him in general because he's so small, and he has a stealth ability, so he can get so many free hits throughout the game that he is just unbelievably strong. The 3rd spot is going to Spirit. Spirit will never not be extremely broken. Every time she goes into her power while a survivor's injured, it's just a 50-50 whether or not she gets the hit, and usually it's in the killer's favor because she's faster. She has very good add-ons. It's really easy to get value out of her because her power is so simple to use. She has mobility, and she's not really map dependent. Just a very well-rounded killer that's really oppressive in chase, and it's kind of hard to not do well with her. The 2nd spot, of course, is going to Blight. Blight is undoubtedly the 2nd strongest killer in the game, even with his add-ons being nerfed in the next update. I've always thought Blight was one of the strongest killers in the game, even in the PTB when everybody thought he was really bad. Just his speed alone makes him a strong killer. Being able to get around the map so quickly gives you a ton of map pressure and can lead to a lot of snowballing situations. I think speed and mobility is what usually makes killers strong because their speed compared to the survivor's speed is a massive difference. So the time it takes for the Blight to do something is much faster than the time it takes for the survivors to do something. He is really hard to use though, and is quite frustrating if you don't know how the hitboxes work, but once you get past that learning curve, he is super strong, but very fun. And finally, of course, the best killer in the game is Nurse. I don't even need to explain it. She breaks the rules of the game and she can go through walls. It's never changed since the day she came out, and it's been like 6 years. Let me know in the comments below if you agree or disagree with this list, and YouTube thinks that you'll like this video, so check it out and see if they're right.